Hey guys, how's it going? Sorry for the technical difficulties. Apologize for that. Thanks again for coming out to DrupalCamp Fox Valley, and thanks again for attending my keynote. Star Trek Voyager, a model for a more inclusive community. So I'm sure you're all wondering why I picked Voyager, because Voyager is everyone's favorite Star Trek, right? Yeah, no. Well, the good thing is I won't be getting into like the different versions of Star Trek, or if Star Wars is better than Star Trek, which it's not, but we won't argue with that. But a little bit about myself for those who don't know me. I'm unabashedly an engineer. I got my degree in electrical engineering at WashU in St. Louis a long time ago, which is really kind of scary. But and I pride myself in kind of thinking about efficiency over everything. And one of the things that I really want to kind of talk about today is efficient learning. How do you learn efficiently? How do you come to solutions in a quick and efficient manner, right? Because if we're all in the space of the internet, and the internet is supposed to be fast and responsive, and it's supposed to be cool and have new cool things, part of it has to not only be what you're building needs to work and be efficient, but how you learn new things needs to be efficient as well. Currently, I'm a senior developer at Phase 2. I'm used to work at Orbit Media, actually, so glad to see Orbit Media here as well. And one of my personal goals, I always continuously strive to do better. So anytime I'm in a conversation with someone, I always want to learn from them, even if I initially believe that they're wrong. Maybe there's something there, right, that we can all learn from. And in that course, that's kind of what this talk is about, my journey to continuously do better from things that I've learned, at least over the past year, that I want to kind of share with you guys. So what specifically are we talking about? How do you marry Star Trek Voyager to our community, right? Drupal community, internet community, the developer community, etc. So first off, again, as I said, this is more about my journey. I just want to kind of share with you the things that I've seen. Again, I have engineering background. I did a little bit of sales and consulting coming out of school. Then I went into interaction design. Then I went into development, did some sales, project management, technical project management, super hardcore developer, all that stuff. So the different things that I've seen and different experiences that I've had, I just thought it'd be really cool to kind of share with you and kind of bring that together and really kind of talk about what I've seen over the last 10 some odd years. I also kind of want to share with you the allegory, right, of Star Trek Voyager. So I really believe, and as I've kind of thought about it, and now that Star Trek has been gone, at least the good versions of Star Trek have been gone for a little while. Going back as an adult and looking back to some of the things that were within the series, and I kind of want to bring that out a little bit in its characters. I also want to talk about context and blind spots. And basically what that means is, how do you know what you don't know? Right? This weird kind of Rumsfeldian thing of the unknown unknowns. Right? How do you have context of what you may not know, and how does that lack of context and blind spot affect your efficient learning, right? How do you know that what you're not considering is ultimately the thing that's keeping you from getting to the point where you want to go, especially within a team? And then this kind of a little bit of a controversial thing, but I think it's really important to talk about, is a theorem posited by a professor out of the University of Michigan, where diversity trumps ability theorem. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So first, I'm going to start off with a quote, because that's what you do in keynotes. You give people a quote, they read it, and they go, that's interesting, that's deep. So, talent hits a target that no one else can hit. Genius hits a target that no one else can see. Again, going back to context and blind spots. Sometimes when you're ultimately trying to get to a certain point, whether you're on a team or within a community, right, the genius solution, the global optimum solution, is something you may not necessarily see. So keep that in mind, that a solution is outside of what you could possibly see. So how do you get there, right? And that journey to get there is part of what I love to do, right? I pride myself in trying to jump and dive into those areas that people sometimes get a little bit weird about, right? The technical parts, the objective things, people, there are parts where in conversations that I've had, so there are objective facts. right? But the sooner you move past objective facts and go into, just PHP, compile, etc., it always keeps boiling down to process. Your teams, the process of your teams to kind of move through those objective facts. And that journey to learn how to bring in and understand and work with others of those objective things ultimately affects projects, it affects budgets, it affects how you learn. Right? It's that gray area that I pride myself in trying to throw myself into with not only kind of an objective and technical perspective, but also, right, a subjective and open-minded perspective. But at the end of the day, what we do is really hard, right? This thing, software, it changes so much. It's changing while we're sitting here. A new JavaScript framework just came out and you guys didn't even know about it, right? It changes so much and it's hard because you've got the technical side of what is this new thing? Is it worth my time? What efficiencies do I gain from learning this new thing? And then you have, what do I apply this new thing to? And not just what do I apply it to, but how do I apply it given the context of what I'm working in, my teams, a project, a client, an end goal, right? It has to be usable. And that's a little bit different than other scientific practices, right? Physics has laws. Chemistry has a periodic table. And yes, there are paradigms within software, right? Hexagonal architecture, I was talking to Dave about that earlier. You've got object-oriented, etc. But those things change. It goes out of fashion, it comes back into fashion, and then, we have to learn that, then not learn that, then bring this part over here and figure out what works, and, well, let's just do it because, we have something we have to do, but we're going to refactor later. Right? There's all these different parts that make what we do very difficult. And that's actually where the allegory of Star Trek Voyager, I think, kind of hits the rubber to the road, in my opinion. So, for those that don't know, and you all should know, you're not a true nerd if you don't know, not sure. Star Trek Voyager, again, was in the Star Trek universe, but the premise of Voyager was that you basically had rebel fighters, right, fighting those from Starfleet. And in the course of that fighting, the group that was fighting ended up getting thrust 80,000 light years away from their home. So you basically had this very complex situation of a group of beings attempting to all go in the same direction, but were on diametric opposites, believing their purposes of where they were at the time. I.e., they had different perspectives of their purpose in life. Okay? What was also interesting about Voyager, as you could probably tell, is that it was one of the first scientific shows to helm a female captain. Right? If you look at the picture up there, you can see that even if you didn't know anything about Star Trek, it has this implication of a utopian type of idea, right? That what you look like, what sex you are, whatever it is, you have to come together to basically solve this very complex problem that what you look like, right, was, or what your background was, either you looked past it or it was part of how you solved it. Right? And I'm going to concentrate on how you solve it because I think that's extremely important. Again, going back to that context and blind spots, that perspective of where they came from was how they were able to solve that problem. And at the time, right, Voyager was always kind of poked and prodded by those who were really into Star Trek because it didn't feel true to the formula, right? It didn't feel like Jean-Luc Picard. It didn't feel like, right, some of the other stuff that was within the universe. But in retrospect, and this is actually from Roger Ebert, when he reviewed the series in retrospect, he used a quote from another TV critic where it said, "A great show has to teach you how to watch it," which means that sometimes when you're looking at something, it takes a little bit of time to understand what you're getting. Sometimes it takes it ending, and then you have to go back and look at it to understand how great it actually was. So if we actually look at the characters within Voyager, let's kind of dive into what they represented. As I said before, Captain Janeway is probably best known now for Orange is the New Black, but for me it would always be Star Trek Voyager. Right? She was the first female captain within that universe, at least on TV at the time, right? The personality that she played within the series was bullheaded. She was simultaneously, right, very impulsive, but very dogmatic. She knew the rules, but she wanted to just kind of do it and move forward. And at the time, a character in that lead role who happened to be female, right, was different. It was very different within the realm of television at that time. But even more so within the Star Trek story, right, again, going back to this complex problem, she had to meld together and bring together and lead a group of people who had different points of view, but were all trying to go in the same direction, while also, right, exploring strange new worlds, etc. Very, very complex problem if you put yourself in her shoes. Right? How do you do that? How do you go and start working with the person you were just fighting life and death, but then somehow get them to trust you, trust your leadership, and then not only trust you, but cooperate with you as well? And as I thought about this example, right, for my own self, I thought about some of her really kind of famous quotes. One of them was, keep your shirt tucked in, go down with the ship, and never abandon a member of your crew. I.e., if you're a leader of a team or a community, if you're put in a position of leadership, loyalty is important, right? Communication is important, and you always ride with your team. You always stay with your community, especially if you're put in charge to lead with them. And I thought about that for myself. If I'm put in charge of a project or I'm put in charge of a group of people, right, am I being open to unorthodoxy? Is it that I'm being micromanaging and dogmatic of how I want things to happen? Or am I being open to different perspectives that I didn't necessarily consider? So I'll leave you with that. Let's kind of put a pin right there. In terms of my journey, that's kind of a big stone right there, right? Am I open to unorthodox thinking, especially if I'm going to lead a particular project? Then we have Tuvok, right? Again, at the time in television, right, it was the first time they had put a black actor within the concept of what a Vulcan was. And at the time, a Vulcan was a calm, logical being. Most actors on TV who happen to be black rarely play this type of character, right? If you think about even within the Star Trek realm, it's rarely in this direction. So from a symbolism perspective, and I had to throw him in here, he was a personal hero of mine when I was growing up, right? Not to mention he happened to be an expert botanist. I love flowers. I love gardening. That's my other thing. So I feel like I have a little bit of a kindred spirit with Tuvok. Tuvok was the chief security officer, and his purpose was to keep peace, right? Provide wisdom to Janeway, experience, and keep himself healthy. And when I think about what his famous quotes were within the show and what he personified, he talked about that it's not easy staying in that realm, staying calm, right? On the contrary, the demand on a Vulcan's character are extraordinarily difficult. Do not mistake composure for ease. So what did that tell me? Is logic guiding my decisions? When I have a conflict with someone, especially within the community or in a team, or I don't understand something, how am I approaching it? And just because the appropriate thing is to approach it with logic and calmness, right, that doesn't mean that's going to be easy. If it was easy, everyone would do it. But we all know that when you're confronted with things that you don't agree with, whether it's on the technical perspective, we should not do it this way, we shouldn't use this language, you should not use this framework, right? There's a way to communicate to people, again, going back to that process of how you do that. And is logic guiding your decisions of how you choose to interact with those people, especially when you're trying to build a team, build a consensus, build a community? And then we have B'Elanna Torres, right? B'Elanna Torres was awesome, especially as a character within Voyager, because on one hand, it was one of the first times in the Star Trek writing that they actually dove into someone's background and character, i.e., who they were greatly influenced what they ended up doing within the context of their responsibilities. So the fact that she had a half Hispanic and half Klingon heritage actually was drawn into her character about the type of character that she was. She struggled with her identity. But she was also put in charge of one of the most important positions outside of being the captain of a ship, right? That we know when you think about the technological marvel that is space travel. Chief engineer. You all know those people on your teams and in the community. The person you go to when you don't know the answer. That person always has to have the answer, right? The guru. She was tough, knowledgeable, independent, but she was also bold. She was brash. And that background made her extremely complex. Now think about that for a second. The person who's supposed to know everything and the ship is completely dependent upon has this complex background and complex personality. It's not the typical person you think about when you want to put your expert technical person in charge. When you think about that, you close your eyes and think about who is the expert. How do I vision an expert technical within a team, within a company, within a community? What does that person look like? What kind of demeanor does that person have? So it brings me to this other point that I kept thinking of. Hidden potential, right? One of the quotes that she stated in the show was, if I sprain my ankle, at least I feel something. I'm not trying to kill myself. I'm trying to see if I'm still alive. The technical person is unorthodox. They're trying to reach out and find other things, which led me to the question, how am I evaluating talent? How do I identify who is the person that should be in charge, right? Or who is the person that I put my weight behind, I put my support behind when it comes to this is going to work. This is the person everyone needs to go to. Again, within the context we're talking about of building a team, building a strong community, do you rely on your own bias a little bit of what you think that person, that demeanor should be, what their background is, right? Of how that person and what responsibility they should have. And then we have my favorite character, right? 7 of 9. 7 of 9 at the time when she was introduced, and she wasn't introduced at the beginning of the show, was groundbreaking, again, at the time in television. As soon as she was introduced, viewership shot up 40%. So her background was she was a former assimilated Borg, right? And for those who don't know what the Borg is, Borg was just a machine race that basically assimilated everything, and their main goal was to be the ultimate being. If you didn't fall in line with the Borg, they just assimilated your species, eradicated your species, and then you became part of the Borg. So their idea was to take the best of every species, and everything else that wasn't related to the best was irrelevant. She was forced to adapt after separating from the collective. She became part of the crew. She had escaped from this collective. And what was really interesting about her character was that she always pushed the envelope. Her devotion to logic, even past from the Vulcan's perspective, and her extreme blunt way of communicating always added a lightning rod to the discussions that were happening as the crew were doing different things, as they were encountering different species or different decisions of what they needed to do. And her favorite quote, right, is, but that is irrelevant. Anytime you would talk about someone's life, someone's perspective, etc., if it wasn't the most efficient, singularly, it wasn't relevant. It wasn't relevant at all. And the lesson that I got from that was, okay, so when it comes to, again, thinking about this journey of the gray area and communicating and context and blind spots, in addition to the facts that I'm trying to learn and things that I'm trying to do, what are the facts? What does math and science say about trying to build better teams, better communities? And that's where this talk a little bit pivots a little bit, and I'll get back to the Star Trek part, but this is where we start getting into, okay, this is real world, right? What does the math and science say about the best and most efficient way to learn something and for groups to be at their most optimal? Again, how do we go all in the same direction using this collective community that we have of different perspectives with the allegory of Voyager kind of giving us a blueprint of the different characters we need to kind of go in that direction? So I introduced this idea, emotional intelligence of groups. And here's a source that kind of defines it. This was on Harvard Business Review. All right, so emotional intelligence, what that means is that how do your members within a group, how do they feel within that group? Do they trust? Do they feel trusted? Do they have a sense of identity? Right? Do they feel that what they're doing is important? Okay? And it's been shown many studies, and I have a source of all the links in this talk, that actually teams who actually develop a higher sense of emotional intelligence, I'll use EQ, it's emotional intelligence quotient, that's why it's EQ, not EI, boost their overall performance. Okay? What does that actually mean, right? At the heart of these conditions of feeling trusted, having a sense of identity, and a sense of feeling important are emotions. Do people feel like that they're being listened to? Okay? So there are studies, science says that in terms of teams, emotional intelligence is important, more important. Okay? There is an extreme high correlation to team effectiveness and team output based on how the members of that team feel when it comes to the factors of emotional intelligence. Okay? Another factor that has a high correlation, having women with part of those teams. And the reason why this is important, especially within our community, right, is because, and by community, I don't mean Drupal, I mean community as in those who are on the internet and those who are technical and those who like to live in this space, on Twitter, etc., who consider themselves technical. Right? There's a stereotype. And you see it sometimes. I mean, Facebook, Google, all the big firms have released their stats of their team makeup. Okay? And this study was published again in Harvard Business Review. And what it basically said was that there was little correlation between the IQ of the members of the team and the collective intelligence of the team itself. What there was a high correlation, though, is that if a team had more women on it, it had a high collective intelligence. I.e., the team was better when women were part of the team. There was a higher correlation to that. That's what science says. Okay? And that's really important. Because, again, if we think about, again, our community, how we build teams, efficient learning. When I think of the teams that I've been a part of and the communities that I've been a part of, this is an interesting nugget. Science is telling me that if this team is to succeed at its most optimal, there need to be women part of this team. Okay? And one of the quotes that came out of that study was, what do you hear about great groups? Not that the members are all really smart, but that they listen to each other. Now, that's not to say that somehow adding women to your group is somehow going to make your group not smart. And that's not to say, right, that I'm implying that women aren't smart, that somehow their intelligence is not related to a group's effectiveness. Right? But the science stated, and I'll get into this a little bit more, and I'll provide mathematical proof actually, right, that there's a high correlation between women in groups and team effectiveness. And there's little correlation to IQ and team effectiveness. Okay? But a few points of clarification. Emotional intelligence is not the same thing as being emotional. And I want to make sure that's very clear. There's no connection between women in groups and the emotions of the group and emotions of women. Okay? Being emotional, stereotypically, right, is not the same thing as having high emotional intelligence. It's actually the opposite. Having high emotional intelligence means that you're in control of your emotions. That you're able to listen, that you're able to understand and communicate effectively with people. Okay? It's also not to say that men can't have high emotional intelligence either. Okay? But science, going back to science, there are many studies that show that there's a higher correlation of higher emotional intelligence to women than men. So from a pure scientific perspective of how to get a better team, okay, emotional intelligence, better output, high correlation between the number of women in a team and the effective output of that team. Okay? That's what I'm going for, efficient learning. Now, obviously, the other part that I want to clarify is that correlation and probability are implied. I'm not saying it's a causation. I'm saying there's a high correlation, right? I'm not saying that this is the answer. I'm saying there's a high probability based on science and research that you're going to go in, if you use this direction, if I use this direction, the teams that I'm a part of will have a higher global optimum, okay? And the last thing I want to point out is that I also recognize that gender is not limited to two choices, okay? But again, I'm staying within the realm of the facts that are presented to me. I am trying to understand from a logic perspective, and I'm trying to be bold to present this idea, right, to the teams that I'm a part of to say, how do we make sure this team is operating at its most effective? And so I'm sure you're thinking, that's great. You've shown a little studies. Okay, I understand I understand. But let's kind of maybe drill it home a little more. What does the math say? Okay? So as I kept looking at my experience with working with effective teams and high team output and solving complex problems, I came across this book called The Difference. And it's by Dr. Scott Page. He's a professor of complex systems, political science, and economics. It was published in 2007. Okay, and he laid out some really crucial theories, and he provided mathematical models, okay, that supported the science of some of the studies I'm talking about in terms of the makeup of groups and the ultimate output of those groups, okay? One of the key things that he talked about was this idea of perspective and heuristic. What is perspective? Perspective is how you look at a problem, all right? How do you evaluate a particular problem? Heuristic, okay, tells a person, whoops, went too far. Come on, catch up. Heuristic tells a person where to search for a solution, okay? Basically what that means is that your experiences, things that you've been exposed to, the fact that you work with Drupal informs how you will look at a problem when a problem is presented to you. You will put it in the perspective of how would I do that in Drupal. You're not going to immediately think, how would I do that in Rails? How would I do that in Laravel? Your heuristic of how you would solve that problem, okay, is based off, again, how well you know Drupal. If you've never used views, you're not going to present that as a possible solution, okay? And what was interesting about this concept of perspective and heuristic, which really hammered it home, was actually a real-world scenario. How we were able to figure out the DNA sequence, okay? So the story is DNA, by its nature, has pairs, okay? When you have one particular protein, it's automatically paired with another protein. That's how the helix works. And the thing they couldn't figure out was how is it that when you split DNA, how does it know, right, to build its appropriate pair? I.e., how do you pass DNA between different beings, different people? That's how DNA is passed. You split it down the middle, and then one half generates the other half, and you share characteristics between two people, right? And scientists for a while could not figure that out, especially within the realm of chemistry. If you're really big into geometry, if you're a mathematician, right, you may look at the problem like this. You have one side, and it always happens, you always get this outcome on the other side. So you'll put it, right, in the perspective that you know. Your heuristic is geometry, math. This is how I would model the problem. If you're a chemist, you may model it this way, right? That these two pairs go together, and they must have some sort of bond, and that bond is how we represent the relationship of what DNA is, how it actually works. Both of these were wrong. This was not what helped solve the DNA sequencing problem, a complex problem. It was this one. This perspective is a fashion designer's perspective. From a fashion designer, professionally, when you're in fashion design, there are definite pairs, okay? There are different things you do not do. You don't wear black pants with brown socks, okay? So if someone's wearing black pants, as a fashion designer in the profession, you can assume they're not going to have brown socks. I.e., if you know one thing, there's a significant direct relationship to the other things because of how they operate together. That perspective of knowing half of something and automatically knowing the other side is how that heuristic helped these people of high IQ solve a very complex problem. Which goes back to the fact that in order to solve complex problems, in order to work together as a team, perspective and heuristic is important. How you come about a problem and what tools you use to solve it change the ultimate solution and the ultimate direction you're trying to go to, which ties back to that allegory of Voyager. So now we come to this theorem, that diversity trumps ability. And the theorem that he posited has a certain set of conditions. The first one, the problem must be hard. I would almost bet that anyone who has worked on a complex problem probably doesn't work on it by themselves. That's why we have teams. That's why we have community. If anyone has looked at any Drupal issue queue before, you've seen that it takes a team of people to solve the problem that is originally posited by a person of what direction we should go, especially when it has 200 plus comments on it. So the first condition for this theorem is that the problem must be very difficult. The other condition is that each solver has a local optima to the problem, i.e. that every person who's part of that team, part of that community, has a perspective and has something that they can provide, which individually would be optimal for them, i.e. they have an expertise, some sort of expertise to the problem, right? That when you're building a team, you don't just bring a random person off the street. You have to bring in people who at least have some sort of perspective of what is going on. The other condition is that an improvement can be made to a non-optimal solution, i.e. that there is the one person's way is not the only way. Going back to my software is difficult, thought. Our realm does not have laws. Things change, things are fluid. It can always be improved, and it's improved based on different factors, right? And then the last condition is that you have a large pool of solvers that form a decent-sized collection, i.e. it's not a team of 2 or 3, okay? So if you bring all those together from a mathematical perspective, it kind of sounds like what we do. Complex problems, everyone has different perspective. Improvements can be made as you go in time, and that we have a large team to do so. And what was interesting about what Dr. Page presented was that he was able to model it mathematically. He was able to create an equation for this theorem. So now we're at the point where it's not just anecdotal, that diversity trumps ability. It has a mathematical equation and scientific study to push that in that direction. Which, again, going back to my journey, is very interesting as an engineer. My whole profession is based off of scientific study and math. And if you want to read that study, here's the link. And I put the link out on my Twitter if you guys want to read all of these different studies. But it's very interesting. But the one thing he came out of it was, as he did this mathematical problem, as he modeled perspective and heuristic in solving complex problems, he said this: problem solvers with diverse perspectives may have trouble understanding solutions identified by other agents. So if you have different people, who are trying to solve a complex problem, that just simply having a diverse team is not enough. That there is hurdles of how those people communicate, which then does what? Brings us right back into emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the definition of how you communicate within a team. And what it has a high correlation to effective teams. High emotional intelligence. from a scientific perspective, what group of us have a high correlation to emotional intelligence? Women. So I'm positing, similar to Star Trek Voyager, that when we're solving complex problems, it's very important to consider this scientific and mathematical push. At least for me, that's what I learned. Because I kind of knew it in the back of my brain, and I'm sure you guys kind of know it too, right? You know that diversity is important, and it's, everyone needs a chance, etc. But now I'm throwing a little bit out there more. That you may actually not be able to provide the best solution for a complex problem within a team if your team does not have high emotional intelligence. And if you're not sure how to achieve high emotional intelligence in your team, there are high correlations which could push you in the right direction. And that's something that I really, really am passionate about. And I learned over this last year. And that was proven when I worked at Orbit, right? As I work at Phase 2. The female colleagues that I work with have made teams and projects better. Me understanding and being aware of my context and blind spots of how I communicate with people have made my teams and my projects and my solutions better. So specifically, right, what did I do? What can I do to make sure that I'm sticking to the science? That I'm not a climate denier of how to make an effective team and how to get the most out of a team. Well, first, I had to kind of push past this idea, because this is one thing you hear a lot, right? That's a pipeline problem. The reason we don't have it is because there's not enough people out there. I'm very cautious of the tail wagging the dog, that the loudest thing that people are saying is the truth, right? And my experiences hasn't shown me that. That if you are open to other perspectives, right, that you're able to go in this direction, and it ultimately has proven out. I also have to be careful, and this is something that I've heard a lot too, I have to be careful of, what does most qualified mean? When I say, or anyone says, we're looking for the most qualified candidate, that has an implied perspective and heuristic. When you're defining what you need as a person, if you're in the position to hire people, or you're in a position to build a team, solve a complex problem, you have to be aware that your propensity to solve that problem has an implied perspective and heuristic. It's based off your experiences. So how you qualify something could ultimately blunt your progress in your desire to have an optimal solution. Okay? So with that said, how do I make sure, what are the things that I try to keep in my brain to make sure that I'm open and aware? First, this concept of being an ally. Right? I'm a man, I'm not a woman. I can't walk in the shoes of women. That doesn't mean I can't be open to it. Right? I can't be open. I haven't had to experience, right, someone asking me, can I have it all? That's not a conversation that happens with men in the workplace. There's really a conversation about what I'm wearing. Am I technical enough? Etc. So me being an ally and constantly making sure that I'm open and that my language is appropriate, right, is important to building an appropriate team. I recognize my privilege as well as a man, right, that there are things that I necessarily will not be exposed to. And why, again, that's important, because that informs my perspective, which ultimately performs my heuristic. Again, going back to the model that I was saying before, I'm trying to find things that I can do so that I remain true to the scientific and mathematical principles that I've learned over this last year of how to build an effective team. Constantly remember the science, because sometimes these kind of topics are very, very sensitive, controversial, they're subjective, objective, etc. People have different opinions, and opinions are good. But at the end of the day, I want to stay like Tuvok. What is the logical outcome? What makes sense? What has worked? What does literature and science tell me? The other thing that I try to do is I stay bold in the compound interest of action. And basically what that means is that I always try my best to do something, not just talk about it. And if I do things over the course of time, they will build up like compound interest and hopefully have a good outcome. And I challenge everyone here to kind of do the same. And again, I also strive for maximum group collective intelligence. Whatever's on the team, I constantly preach this idea that it's about the process. When I hear people say you're doing it wrong or don't do it this way, that's not an emotionally intelligent conversation, and that's ultimately going to affect the team. Most budget overruns is not because of the technology you're using. It's because of the process that you have and how the teams work together. Are you open to other perspectives within the team? Are the team members open? How many times do you have to refactor? Is refactoring a product of lack of communication? Right? And I think, how great can our community be if we stick to these principles? We have science and math staring us in the face. We all pride ourselves to be in the space. And I feel it's my duty within this space to posit the science, put this out there, and let you guys decide. How will I help us get home? Complex problem of building something that everyone can use and everyone feels a part of. Right? Here's our few sources again. If you guys want to take a look at these. Following those scientific principles, you always got to source what you're talking about. Right? Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. I don't know if we have, I think we're supposed to start now, so.
What's that?
Are we supposed to start the next round? I don't know if you have time for questions or anything. But.
Yeah, we can use a quick round of sections. So we are slightly behind schedule, not nearly as far as we were last year, but we got plenty of time to catch up. So if there's any questions, feel free now. Once we're done with that, we're going to probably take a 5 to 10 minute break and then get the next round of sessions kicked off. Looks like you've got questions.
Yes.
I wonder if you have ideas about improving the emotional intelligence of folks who are already on these homogenous. Because I don't think that, as a woman, I can't do it.
Yeah, if somebody threw me onto a team being like, you're the emotional intelligence, and nobody else wants to listen, like, that's a terrible position for me.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I guess the one thing is that if someone is taking, so the question was, how do you communicate the idea of emotional intelligence within a homogeneous group? And first of all, if emotional intelligence is being wielded like a sword of it's your problem, not mine, that's probably more of a indicator of a lack of emotional intelligence on that person than anything. I think the one thing that that I would recommend is, again, find an ally. I mean, there are allies out there. It's not a woman problem. It's actually a men problem. It's a developer problem. I mean, I've been part of this community for a while, and again, it's not anything bad. We're not doing anything to like hurt each other. But again, statements like you're doing it wrong, or this is the better way to do it, or things of that nature, while again intended to not be negative, they're not the most efficient and best emotionally intelligent way to communicate something. So if someone decides, if the group decides that they don't think this factor is important, then I guess you have two choices. One, you basically accept that the solution you're going to come out from this group is not going to be the best, and you then have to decide, okay, am I okay with that? And two, I guess the other decision is, can I find an ally who can help me communicate these ideas? That's the advice I have. Sometimes sending someone a link or whatever, that doesn't help. Sometimes trying to have the conversation doesn't help. It just really kind of depends, what your choice is. But to be clear, I will be the first one to say this is not a woman issue. This is actually, an issue for those who have the chance to speak out about how we can actually get better, and it's past anecdotal. It's scientific and mathematically proven. So, yeah, I don't know if that helps, but sorry, sir.
Is there a racial component in relation to emotional intelligence?
Sure. I don't know. I haven't found any studies for that. It's actually a good question. So the question was, is there a racial component to emotional intelligence? I don't know. And as I've gone around and talked to people, a lot of people are wondering, like, why don't you talk about race? You're a black guy. Like, why don't you talk about race? And and what's interesting, I'm purposely not, because the point of being an ally is you recognize your privilege and you speak on your privilege that you have. And the privilege that I have is that I'm a man. I don't have the privilege of being not black, so I can't speak on that. Like I said, the other part is that I don't have the studies to connect that. I don't know if those studies have been done. That's just not something that I have at my disposal. But again, the idea is not to say that it's concrete or cut and dry. What I'm simply trying to posit is there's a high correlation. And I think it's up to everyone in this room to decide whether they want to be open to that high correlation of scientific and mathematical connection to, solving complex problems, or not. So, but that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. So
Even if race doesn't have an effect on emotional intelligence, it definitely has an effect on perspective.
correct.
Right? Like race, class background, all that
Yeah,
stuff.
speaking a different language, etc. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's my point. Is that when you get into the meat of how you're trying to solve things, it boils down to perspective and heuristic. And you're right, perspective can be informed by a lot of things. I just happen to highlight a scientific study that happens to have a high correlation of those who identify as women to this other thing. But there could be other ones out there that affect, the perspective to solve complex problems. Absolutely. Yes.
So if our background and our experience affects our perspective, and our perspective having a diverse array of perspectives on a team is important for the team to perform, does that mean that our background and our experience is always important to us working as a group?
Absolutely.
So it's always relevant.
It's always relevant. And that's probably
Who we
the...
are and where we come from and what we know, our cultural experiences, our gender expression, our racial background, it's all important to working as a team.
Absolutely. And so, and I'm assuming the implication you're making is that it is not efficient to make the statement of, well, I don't see X. That actually is going in the other direction, because it's the acknowledgement of X and your openness to that perspective and understanding how to communicate with different perspectives that ultimately make your team better. Simply saying you look past it or don't see it means you're not going to have the appropriate communication. So yes, it was always important. And again, while it may sound anecdotal, I really encourage you to read Dr. Page's paper. He puts it in mathematical terms. He puts it in models of finding the perfect cup of coffee, to finding the perfect pair of shoes. Perspective is extremely important. Any other questions? Thank you, I appreciate it.